For 2 years, the Society of St. Pius X has been involved in doctrinal discussions with Rome in order to clarify the many errors resulting from the Second Vatican Council, which have created a severe crisis in the Catholic Church. These discussions have now come to an end, and it remains to be seen how the situation with the Society will ultimately conclude. This morning on The Voice of Catholic Tradition, host Joe Bagnoli discusses this situation with Mr. John Salza, noted Catholic apologist, author, and lecturer. Mr. Salza states the main points of contention, which are religious liberty, ecumenism, and collegiality. Mr. Salza expertly defines the source of these doctrinal problems and why correcting them is so vital to the restoration of the Catholic Church.
Good morning, John.
And good morning to you, Joe.
Welcome back again to the Voice of Catholic Tradition.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks for being our guest. John, we have very little time this morning as usual, and there's so much to discuss. So let's get right to the point here. It is general knowledge for many that over the last 2 years there have been doctrinal discussions between the Society of St. Pius X and Rome concerning canonical recognition of the Society. And obviously, even Rome admits that we are not in a new springtime for the Church and that we do have a genuine crisis in our Church. And for clarification for our listening audience, we'll start with this point. When we refer to doctrinal discussions, or doctrinal discussions, how you wish to express it, what exactly do we mean?
Well, the Society, and remember, this isn't just a society. This is all good Catholics who know their faith, who know what the magisterium has always taught. There are points of doctrine that came up during the Second Vatican Council that appeared to be at odds with what the Church has always taught. Among them are such teachings as religious liberty, as ecumenism, as collegiality, as this notion that the Muslims worship the same God that we do, that the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, which could mean it's broader than the Catholic Church, and many other things. And so the doctrinal discussions are focused on these points of contention, that is, those issues that appear to deviate from Church teaching. And why is that, Joe? Well, it's because the mission of the Society is the salvation of souls. And that is through the means that the Church has provided to us for nearly 2,000 years, the traditional Mass, the traditional sacraments, the traditional theology of the Church. That is what the Church has taught and practiced up until Vatican II. And so when we have teachings that have compromised the faith, and as you said, even the Conciliar Church has recognized that we are in a catastrophic crisis as a result of Vatican II, stemming from Vatican II, as Our Lady has warned at Fatima, the faithful have a right to know about these evils because they have a right to save their souls, and these novelties are a threat to souls, and hence the Society has to have the freedom to be able to point these issues out. And this is what the Society has done over the course of the past couple of years with the theologians in Rome. And so if the Society is wrong, then the Vatican has the duty to demonstrate why they are wrong, but if they're not wrong, then they have the duty to take their position. And so that's where we are at this point.
Okay, and you mentioned the three basic elements of these discussions, religious liberty, ecumenism, and collegiality, among other things, so many things to discuss. Let's start with religious liberty, John. And here there is a tremendous amount of confusion with the concept. I would say across the board, New Order Catholics, traditional Catholics, it doesn't matter. Explain religious liberty as defined by the Second Vatican Council.
Okay, the Council comes along in 1965 in its document Dignitatis Humanae and says that a man has a right to religious liberty based upon his dignity and nature. Now here's the issue, Joe. The issue is how to understand terms. A right to religious liberty. There is no such thing as a right to religious liberty if it means worshiping outside the Catholic Church. This is what people have to understand. Non-Catholics do not have a right to worship outside the Church. The Church, for 2,000 years, has always made a distinction between an objective right to worship God in the true religion, which is the Catholic religion, and the subjective freedom to choose evil, to choose a false religion. The objective is something that is independent of the mind, and the subjective is what's perceived by the mind, which may be right or wrong. Here's the problem. The Church has always used the word right, the Latin use, this word right, in the objective sense. Pope Leo XIII says in Libertas that right is a moral liberty. It's something which is due to us in justice, okay? And that right means we have a right to save our souls by knowing the truth, which is the object of the intellect, and choosing the good, which is the object of the will. So using the word right can only be to know truth and do good. And hence a right to religious liberty means only the right to be Catholic. There is no such thing as a right to religious liberty for non-Catholic worship and practice. Now the problem is, Dignitatis Humanae says that man has a right to religious liberty, again, based on his dignity and nature. Well, dignity and nature are objective, God-given realities, you see. And the other thing is that the document itself, Dignitatis, says that the right that the council is talking about, it specifically says this, is not rooted in the subjective disposition of the person, but is based on his objective dignity and nature. This is what Archbishop Lefebvre sought clarification on when he submitted his dubia to Rome, which they never answered. This is what many theologians, including the Society, have inquired about. Is Dignitatis saying that man has an objective right to practice any religion? That's what it appears to say. I mean, if human dignity is the basis of a right and God gives the dignity, that means God is therefore giving the right. But God does not give the right to man to do evil, right? To say that God gives man the right to do evil, is blasphemous and heretical. And that is just how Dignitatis Humanae can be interpreted. And so the Society is asking for a clarification from the Holy Father to define religious liberty the way the Church has always defined it. The objective right to worship only in the Catholic Church. That is the teaching of Blessed Pius IX, Leo XIII, Pius X, Pius XI, and Pius XII.
In other words, John, we're not talking about the civil right to freely practice a religion. That's complete, and this is the confusion that a lot of people have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's wrong with everyone having the right to practice their religion? Well, we call that tolerance.
That's correct.
We call that tolerance, but that's not what. And I've had discussions with people, and they think that's religious liberty. And
Absolutely,
you just clarified,
yeah.
And it's not.
It is not. You make a very good point there. There is no, and here's another thing. Well, let me clarify what you just said. There is no right to religious tolerance for non-Catholic worship. Let's be clear about that.
Right.
Non-Catholics not only do not have the right to practice their false religions, but they don't even have a right to tolerance for their non-Catholic worship. Tolerance is something that the state will do to secure a greater good. Okay, the state tolerates evils, but it doesn't give people a right to do evil. Protestants, they don't have a right to their false religions, nor do they have a right to be tolerated in their religions. The state tolerates evil only to secure a greater good. And the Church teaches that evil must be suppressed if possible. And so if we were living in a Catholic state, the false religions would be suppressed, since suppressing them would not upset the common good. Well, of course, we don't live in a Catholic state, and that's why, it's permissible for the state to tolerate all these religions, but that does not give people the right to practice their false religion.
All right, and therein lies the difference. And if I'm not mistaken, since Vatican II, haven't there been many concordats between the Vatican and the very few nations left professing Catholicism as their official religion?
You're correct. I mean, this happened in Spain, France, all over Europe, and they all point to the doctrine of the Second Vatican Council, that man has a right to believe and profess what he wants. And this is, again, contrary to the infallible condemnations of Blessed Pius IX and Quanta Cura and his syllabus of errors, and Leo XIII and the other popes that I mentioned.
Now, would you say that it is this difficulty with religious liberty that has created a very fertile breeding ground for false ecumenism?
Absolutely, because if man has a right to practice whatever religion he wants, then that takes away the missionary mandate of the Church, doesn't it? Why should I attempt to convert somebody if they have a God-given right, that is a right from God based upon their objective dignity and nature to worship as they see fit? That's the error that is born from it. And this is where we have this false notion of Christian unity, okay? People are praying for Christian unity, which in a sense is nonsense, because the creed tells us that the church is already unified. We're not praying to have Christian unity. We're praying that the Protestants, the dissidents, return to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. This is again the difference between the preconciliar teaching of the Church and the Vatican II Church. The Church has always said the dissidents must return. This is also where you get this false notion of fullness of truth. You know, we hear all the time now, we never heard this before, but now we hear that Protestants don't have the fullness of truth, that Catholics have the fullness of truth. Well, what does that mean? Do the Protestants have some truth? Does that mean they're partially saved? There's no such thing. If a person rejects just one doctrine of the Catholic faith, he rejects the entire faith. He is severed from the mystical body of Christ for heresy or apostasy, and he's going to hell. That's what the Church has always taught. There can be no partial communion with the Church because there can be no partial salvation. You're either saved or you're not. You're either in a state of grace or you're not. You know, were the 7 other members of Noah's family only partially on the ark, or were they completely in the ark? You see? So once you attack, you know, the Church's teaching on, you know, the right to only the good and only what is true, all of these errors follow suit, and that's what we've seen in the Conciliar Church.
Right, and there's something here I'd like to just read in reference to the ideas you've been discussing. It says, Dignitatis Humani, the document stands on religious freedom. It shamefully repudiates the first commandment of the Old Testament by legalizing the worship of false gods. It also essentially neutralizes the teaching of the New Testament that salvation is through Jesus Christ alone. And in addition, Dignitatis Humani constitutes a renunciation of any spiritual or moral rights and duties that the Church by divine right has over the state, since the Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Mm-hmm. So here we have, and a lot of people say, well, you know, the Catholic Church has denied Jesus. No, but in most ways, the New Order Church has denied the kingship of Christ. Would you say that's true?
That's absolutely true, and it's sad to even say that the U.S. bishops right now are fighting against Obama's contraception mandate under this false principle of religious liberty.
Yes,
okay?
They are.
You cannot argue against error by using erroneous principles. All right. First of all, if religious liberty were a true principle, then Protestants who reject Catholic teaching have a right to practice contraception, and we should leave them alone. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing is, and it's just what you said, you know, Pope Leo said, enough already with man's rights. What about the rights of God? Obama's mandate must be rejected not because it violates religious liberty. There is no such thing, not for non-Catholics, but because it violates the rights of Jesus Christ and the natural law. You know, not to mention the baby who may be conceived in the mother's womb. So this is the error of the U.S. bishops. They have confused the right to religious liberty, which means the right only to worship in the Catholic Church. They've confused the right to religious liberty with the right to be free from coercion. This is another distinction, Joe. You made a distinction between religious liberty and tolerance. There's another important distinction here, religious liberty versus freedom from coercion. St. Augustine was clear that we have a right not to be coerced into choosing against our conscience. But that does not mean that we have a right to choose what we want. Freedom from coercion is not the same thing as religious freedom. Now, Obama is trying to coerce people into providing contraception. And a person has a right not to be coerced into offering contraception, but they don't have a right to offer contraception, you see? So that's a key distinction. I have a right to worship and practice Catholicism, and I have a right not to be coerced into practicing Catholicism, but I do not have a right to practice a non-Catholic religion. These are key distinctions, and they've become completely muddy in the Conciliar Church.
Now, John, your explanation is perfect. I mean, it really spells out what the problem is. Now, would you say, therefore, that at the heart of the difficulties that exist, and I'm referring to the SSPX discussions because that's what is the biggest news today in the Catholic Church with Rome, the heart of the difficulties stem from religious liberty and ecumenism. in terms of the Second Vatican Council? That those two, could we capsulize it and put it into that one little position there?
I believe that that's the case, Joe. I would put it primarily on religious liberty and ecumenism because it strikes at the heart of the mission of the Catholic Church that Christ founded, the salvation of souls. Religious liberty leads to an indifferentism. Okay, ecumenism leads to an indifferentism, which does not look at the Church any longer as the sole and exclusive means of salvation. That is why this is at the heart of the doctrinal discussions between the Society and Rome, and also, as I've said before, at the heart of the message of Fatima. When Our Lady began giving the words of the third secret, she said the dogma of the faith in Portugal will always be preserved, etc. The other words to follow have been suppressed by the Vatican, but we can logically conclude that those words mean that the dogma of the faith will not be preserved elsewhere. And the primary way that the dogma of the faith has been attacked is the attack on no salvation outside the Church. That is the key dogma that has been attacked by religious liberty and by ecumenism. And, as I've said before, too, even the Freemasons have praised the teachings of Second Vatican Council. I've said this in my speeches on Fatima. I've given quotations from them. Yves Macedon was one of the famous Freemasons who even wrote a book on ecumenism, viewed by traditional Freemasons. So when the Masons are praising the teachings of a supposed council of the Roman Catholic Church, we know there is a problem. And the problem is that religious liberty is a Masonic principle. It was designed by the Freemasons. It's promoted by the Freemasons. It was adopted by the Council. And Our Lady warned at Quito and Fatima that Masonry would penetrate the Church in the middle of the 20th century. That's what's happened. I want to point out something else, Joe, that's very interesting. Father Ratzinger, of all people, in his 1966 book, the Theological Highlights of Vatican II, he admitted then, right after the council closed, that Dignitatis Humani contradicts the teaching of Pius XI and Pius XII. And I have the book here, and I'm quoting from it. He says, these compromising formulas should have been omitted or at least reformed. That's on page 147. The Pope, as theologian, admitted that Dignitatis Humani contradicts the teachings of Pius XI and Pius XII, not to mention the infallible condemnations of religious liberty by Pius IX and the perennial teachings of Leo XIII. And so one must wonder what is going on here, since what the Society is discussing is the same position that the Pope has held, and he's held publicly. I raise the question not as an insider because I don't know, but to what extent is the Pope truly involved in these discussions?
Yes, that's an excellent question, because when we talk about this, many people are under the impression that the representatives of society are on one side of the table and the Pope is on the other side, and that's not true. If I'm not mistaken,
it is not true.
That is not true. There are representatives from Rome who are discussing these things with the experts from the society. And
right.
What you point out about what has been said about the Masonic objectives, many people pose this question. Why doesn't the New Order Catholic Church see these clear objectives of the Masonic Order? Why is it that we traditionalists look like we are the conspiracy nuts, and we are the only ones that see this, but no one else sees this? Why is that?
Well, in my opinion of it, Joe, is because Catholics have succumbed to what is called false obedience. The problem, as Our Lady warned, is that the apostasy in the Church would begin at the top. And that means that many of the clerics of the Roman Catholic Church at the highest levels are working for the devil, and they're deceiving the faithful. Well, if the faithful do not know their faith, and that's probably attributable to the fact that they weren't catechized by these very men who are under this diabolical disorientation, they simply submit to their authority and are led astray. And Scripture teaches us, and tradition teaches us, that this is one of God's worst punishments, that he sends wicked clerics, evil priests and bishops to mislead the faithful. even though the faithful may be ignorant, God's wrath is so severe in this case that we're all going to perish at the hands of these wicked men. So I believe it's an example of false obedience. Catholics have put obedience, which is a moral virtue, higher than the theological virtue of faith, of supernatural faith. Of course, faith is highest, and if there's anything that compromises faith, we can't obey. We cannot obey these clerics.
So we have false obedience on one hand, and we have a neutralization of knowledge by very poor catechesis over the last 40, 50 years. You put these two things together, and trying to profess the truth is becoming more and more difficult.
It is. It's the diabolical disorientation that Sister Lucia referred to.
I recommend Archbishop Lefebvre's open letter to confused Catholics. If anyone wants to read about what it is that is confusing the Catholics, read that book by Archbishop Lefebvre. And you point out this aspect of false obedience. What are you being obedient to? The question comes up time and time again. Mm-hmm. And for example, even Pope Leo the 13th in his encyclical Satis Cognitum, he warned of the necessity to guard the integrity of the faith against those who would differ in any point from the true doctrine of the Church, even if they admit the whole cycle of doctrine. By one word, as with a drop of poison, they are able to infect the entire apostolic faith. And that's what you're talking about.
You got that right. And that's what I was referring to, Satis Cognitum. He says if one rejects even one doctrine of the Catholic faith, he is no longer Catholic. Did the Pope say they have a lesser means of salvation or they're in partial communion? No. He said they're no longer Catholic, they're severed from the mystical body and on the road to perdition, unless they repent and be reconciled to Christ's one and only Church.
And that's exactly it. It's either you're on board with the Catholic faith or you're not. And you get the feeling that there are many people out there who are trying to create a new Catholicism and force it down the throats of every Catholic as this is the way it's supposed to be. Right. We didn't exactly have it right before the Second Vatican Council. Mm-hmm. And now we've got it right, and that's where we're going to go. And we have, and another, I use as a basis sometimes for our interviews, questions that people come up with. Why doesn't the Pope just step forward and say, this is the way I want it to be? Let's say, for example, the Society of St. Pius X is Catholic, and they will be recognized canonically within the Catholic Church. Why is it that the Pope doesn't have this absolute power? I mean, he could make a motu proprio, I guess.
Sure.
But I'm getting to the point of collegiality here.
Uh-huh.
And that was the third point that we had referred to as essential in the discussions. What has happened, for example, that has diminished this, let's say, this one-time vertical authority structure that existed with the Pope?
Oh, this is a very good point and something Catholics also need to be aware of. The Vatican was restructured during the reign of Paul VI under Cardinal Villot, who was a documented Freemason. And before this time, the Church was always structured where the Pope reigned over the Church. Underneath the Pope was the Holy Office, or the Inquisition, who was responsible for the doctrinal integrity of the Church's teachings. And then underneath the Holy Office was the rest of the congregations, that reported up through the office and to the Pope directly. What happened in 1967, Joe, is under this Masonic, the revolution of the Church right after the Council, the Church was restructured so that now we no longer have a holy office, We have what is now called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has been effectively demoted to just one of many congregations, each of which have their own prefects, which report not directly to the Pope, but to the Vatican Secretary of State, who acts as a vice pope or a de facto pope, who sits between the Holy Father and the congregations that have to report to him. You see? And by the way, this Vatican Secretary of State position is not even part of the divine constitution of the Church. It's a Vatican functionary. He really doesn't have any, spiritual or divine mandate. It's not part of the Church's divine constitution, but this is the structure of the Church now. And this is why we can understand how information can be manipulated, because the things that are coming out of the congregations, doctrine of the faith, the congregation for the sacraments, for the priests, and so forth, go directly to the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Bertone, and not necessarily with the approval of the Pope. This is how Bertone was able to manage the Third Secret and was able to manage the consecration of Russia issue. Well, we know, and we've talked about in other programs, how Pope Benedict has publicly spoken against Bertone's position that Fatima is not of the past, it still relates to the future with prophecies yet to be fulfilled. But this explains to Catholics how, in fact, documents can come out of Rome without any assurance that they have been ratified and approved formally by the Pope.
And that is, talk about confusion as a tool of the devil. That is exactly what we have, because when you read a communique that comes from, you said the Vatican says, the Vatican says. And that's what we're hearing. And I think a very recent example of that, this confusion over the neo-catechumenal way. Mm-hmm. That after all the hoopla last January of the approval of the neo-catechumenal way, finally, not too long ago, the Pope comes out and says, well, wait a minute, what they call the liturgy may not be the liturgy, isn't the liturgy of the Catholic Church. Right. And yet it was given a great fanfare. And I think that had to do with a lack of communication.
And this is why the apostasy has begun at the top, as Our Lady says in the Third Secret, which will someday be revealed. It's at the very top, starting with the Secretary of State, who is controlling Vatican affairs, even matters of doctrine and discipline and liturgy. And this is what's going on right now in the Church. And
this is what we see right now. So when we talk about the discussions that have been taking place over the last couple of years, you have to wonder about the clarity of the exchange of ideas between, let us use, in this case, specifically the society and the Pope. How absolute is the exchange of ideas and differences? How are they being accepted? And another question is, if, as Bishop Fillet has in most of his interviews prior to this date, has made it very clear, he says the Pope wants this union. He has said that many, many times again. But it makes you wonder how many other people do not want this union.
That's right. You know, St. Paul says don't participate in the unfruitful works of darkness. Now, all of this has been going on behind closed doors for a prudential reason, okay? But it's going to come to a point where this has to be made public. The people have to see what the society is presenting and what the theologians in Rome are presenting, and how these novelties that come out of the conciliar church are at odds with what the church has always believed and practiced. That's what's on the table right now. It goes to the dogma of the faith, and it goes to the faith of the Catholic Church.
Well, John, we're at this position now, as we draw, I guess we're running out of time again, that a communique has been issued from the SSPX General House. As everyone knows, on Wednesday, June 13th, Bishop Fillet, the Superior General of Society, accompanied by Father Pfluger, who was the first Assistant General, was received by Cardinal Levada, the prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine, and they obviously had a discussion on the doctrinal declaration and the doctrinal preamble. And I'm just reading what has come across. It says, during this meeting, Bishop Fillet listened to explanations and further details from Cardinal Levada, to whom he presented the situation of the Society of St. Pius X, and spelled out the doctrinal difficulties posed by the Second Vatican Council and the Novus Ordo Missae. The desire for additional clarifications could result in a new phase of discussions. And I believe that's where we stand right now, John. What would be your thoughts on this position?
Well, until the Holy Father comes out and renders a definitive judgment, I cannot trust that this is coming from the Pope, for the reasons that we've discussed. Levada reports to Bertone. We know, based on public information, that that's where the resistance itself against the society is. So until the Holy Father comes out, as he did, okay, with liberating the unjust restrictions on the true Mass and the unjust excommunications on the bishops, until that happens, I won't have any assurance personally that this is coming from the Holy Father.
So at this point, John, as we close our interview, we'll continue to pray.
We must continue to pray. The fact that Bishop Fillet has once again presented the doctrinal issues and still has received evidently a documentation of potential canonical regularization, that may be a positive sign, but we don't know what the terms of that document are, so we'll have to reserve judgment until that's made public.
Okay, John, and we'll do that, and I want to thank you for sharing your precious time with us. And John, when that does happen, I would like to have another discussion with you where we can go a step further.
I look forward to it.
All right, thank you, John. John Salza, thank you very much for being with us this Sunday morning. God bless you.
God bless.
Bye.
You have been listening to a very important interview with Mr. John Salza, who expertly describes the current situation between the Vatican and the Society of St. Pius X. His analysis of religious liberty, ecumenism, and collegiality sheds light on why these doctrinal discussions were so crucial for the correction of these errors. The goal of the Society of St. Pius X is to restore all things in Christ by returning to the true traditions of the Church, founded on the deposit of faith revealed to us by our Lord and handed down from Peter, our first Pope, and the Apostles, our first bishops. We encourage our listeners to visit Mr. Salza's website, www.scripturecatholic.com, for an abundance of truly Catholic information and resources.